Two great capitals, millions of civilians, and a war that no longer cared where the front line ended during the brutal Iran-Iraq War. The battle did not stay in trenches or deserts. It climbed into the night sky and came crashing down on apartment blocks, schools, markets, and sleeping families. In Tehran and Baghdad, sirens replaced silence. Basements became shelters, and ordinary people became targets in a cycle of revenge known as the War of the Cities. Why did both sides choose to strike civilians? How did families survive under missiles? And how did fear in the capitals help bring one of the 20th century's longest wars to an end? We entered the streets, shelters, and shattered nights of a forgotten chapter of modern history. The war between Iran and Iraq was supposed to be fought at the front, across marshlands, deserts, trenches, and ruined border towns. Soldiers bled for every kilometer of ground. For years, artillery thundered along the frontier while commanders promised breakthroughs that never truly came. Yet by the middle of the 1980s, the conflict had hardened into something more dangerous than movement. It had become a stalemate. Neither side could win outright, and neither side was willing to stop what began in September 1980, when Iraqi forces crossed into Iran, hoping for a quick victory, had instead become one of the longest and bloodiest wars of the 20th century. Iraq's leadership expected Iran to collapse after the upheaval of the 1979 revolution. Instead, the invasion united many Iranians against a foreign attacker. Iraqi troops were pushed back from much of the territory they had seized. Then, Iran carried the war into Iraqi lands, seeking justice, security, and the fall of the regime that had invaded them. But years of offensives brought mountains of casualties and little decisive change by 1984. The front lines looked less like roads to victory and more like scars carved into the earth. Muddy trenches stretched across the south. Fortified positions stared at each other across killing fields. Human wave assaults, armored thrusts, and artillery barrages consumed lives without ending the deadlock. The war had become a machine that devoured soldiers and returned only grief when armies could not break each other in the field. Leaders often searched for other ways to apply pressure. In Iraq, President Saddam Hussein looked beyond the battlefield. If Iran's armies could not be defeated quickly, perhaps Iran's people could be frightened into demanding peace. The target would no longer be only troops, bridges, or supply depots. The target would be morale itself, and morale lived in the cities of the capital of Iran. Tehran was a vast city of government offices, factories, crowded apartment blocks, markets, schools, and families trying to survive wartime shortages. It was not a trench line. It was not a military base. It was home to millions of civilians. Yet in this new phase of the conflict, the distinction mattered less and less. Iraqi aircraft began striking urban areas deeper inside Iran. Air raid sirens became part of daily life. The scream of vengeance overhead could mean seconds to react. Windows shattered from blast pressure. Smoke rose from districts that only hours earlier had been ordinary neighborhoods. Some targets had military or industrial value. Money attacks landed where civilians lived and worked. Then came missiles, and like bombers, missiles did not need pilots to cross defended skies. They could be launched from afar, arcing across darkness toward cities whose residents might never hear the weapon until impact. Their accuracy was limited, their destructive power blunt. In practice, that meant terror spread wider than precision ever could. For the people of Tehran, war changed shape overnight. Parents kept clothes ready beside beds in case they needed to run. Children learned the meaning of sirens before they learned algebra. Basements became shelters. Mosques opened their lower halls. Schools adjusted schedules or closed after attacks. In apartment buildings, neighbors who barely knew one another now shared candles. Blankets and fearless cities' nights were transformed. Blackouts darkened streets to make bombing harder. Elevators stood still. Traffic lights failed. Candles flickered behind covered windows. Somewhere in the distance, anti-aircraft guns hammered upward into unseen skies. Then came silence, the most frightening sound of all, because silence meant waiting. Some families chose to leave. Roads out of the capital filled with cars, buses, trucks, and whatever transport people could find. They carried children, elderly parents, bedding, and a few valuables they could save. Those who had relatives in smaller towns fled to them. Those who did not often stayed, hoping the next missile would land somewhere else others could not leave. Workers were needed in factories. Officials remained in offices. Shopkeepers reopened damaged stores. Doctors and nurses reported 2 hospitals already crowded with the wounded. Firefighters entered burning buildings, while the risk of another strike still hung overhead. Daily life did not continue because people were unafraid. It continued because survival required routine. The government urged resilience. State media framed endurance as patriotism. Posters praised sacrifice. Funeral processions honored the dead. Yet no speech could erase the private reality inside homes where children cried at every distant sound, where mothers counted family members after each blast, and where fathers wondered whether staying in the city was courage or recklessness. Was the true meaning of the War of the Cities. It was not only the destruction of buildings, it was the deliberate expansion of war into kitchens, classrooms, and bedrooms. It was the weaponization of uncertainty. No one knew where the next strike would fall. That ignorance was itself a form of violence. Tehran was not alone. Other Iranian cities faced attacks as well. Factories, transport links, and urban neighborhoods all existed under threat. The farther the war reached into civilian space, the harder it became to pretend the front was somewhere else still. The strategy did not produce the quick collapse its architects hoped for. Fear can weaken a society, but it can also harden it. Many civilians adapted with astonishing resilience. Shelters were organized. Emergency services improved. Families developed routines for raids. Communities learned how to carry on under pressure, yet adaptation came at a cost. Children lost years of normal life. Families were displaced. Trauma settled quietly into memory. Even on days without explosions, everyone lived in expectation of them. The battlefield had changed forever. Trenches still existed in the south. Soldiers still died along the frontier. But now another front had opened above rooftops, and behind apartment walls. The war had reached the city's end. Once that line was crossed, there would be no easy return. When one city is struck, another often answers to attacks on Tehran. Did not remain a one-sided campaign for long. Iran, determined not to appear helpless, and unwilling to let Iraq control the rhythm of escalation, sought ways to retaliate. If Iraqi missiles could reach Iranian neighborhoods, then Iraqi civilians would also learn what it meant to live beneath the shadow of sudden fire. The logic was brutal, simple, and familiar throughout history. Pain would be answered with pain soon. The capital of Iraq, Baghdad, entered the same nightmare for years. Baghdad had been presented by the Iraqi state as the confidence center of a nation at war but still functioning. Government buildings stood as symbols of authority. Broad avenues carried workers, soldiers, and school children. Markets remained crowded, cafes still filled with conversation. Official broadcasts projected control, discipline, and certainty. But certainty is fragile when missiles are falling. Iran's retaliatory strikes came through air raids when possible, and through the missiles it gradually acquired during the war. These weapons were limited in number, often difficult to maintain, and far from precise. But precision was no longer the defining feature of the conflict. The purpose was psychological as much as military. Every launch carried a message. Your cities are vulnerable. Too then came the explosions in Baghdad. Apartment windows burst inward from shockwaves. Streets once lit by shop signs and headlights were suddenly lit by flames. Dust rolled through neighborhoods in thick clouds. Sirens wailed over the roar of emergency vehicles. Families who had gone to sleep in ordinary rooms woke to shattered glass, collapsed walls, and the instinctive need to run just as in Tehran. Civilians learned that modern war did not always announce itself with armies on the horizon. Sometimes it arrived without warning, crossing hundreds of kilometers. In minutes, the missile campaigns were especially terrifying because of their randomness. These were not guided weapons capable of striking a single room or vehicle with modern accuracy. They were crude, compared with later technologies, capable of landing near intended targets. But near was often enough to destroy homes, schools, shops, and streets filled with people who had no role in military planning. A government ministry might be the aim. A residential block might pay the price. This uncertainty reshaped daily life. In both capitals in Tehran, children began recognizing the sounds of anti-aircraft guns, engines, and impacts the way other children recognize songs. Families discussed where to stand in hallways during raids, which staircases were safest, and how quickly they could reach the basement if sirens began at night. Mothers packed emergency bags. Fathers checked windows and water supplies. Grandparents tried to calm everyone while hiding their own fear in Baghdad. The same rituals emerged. Blankets were moved closer to shelters. Important papers were kept together. Relatives called one another after every strike, asking the same question in different words. Are you alive? The war created strange forms of knowledge. Civilians judged distance by the delay between flash and sound. They estimated the size of an explosion from the trembling of doors. Some claimed they could tell whether a missile was incoming or outgoing by the character of the noise. Whether true or not, such habits revealed how deeply violence had entered everyday thought. Hospitals became another frontline. Doctors and nurses in both countries worked through waves of casualties. Burns, fractures, shrapnel wounds, smoke inhalation, and shock. Ambulances raced through blackout streets toward buildings that might still be unstable. Surgeons operated while exhausted. Blood shortages became recurring crises. Emergency wards filled with the injured and the grieving alike. Firefighters and rescue crews faced their own peril. They searched damaged structures while fearing secondary strikes. They climbed through concrete dust and twisted metal, listening for voices beneath rubble. Sometimes they found survivors. Sometimes they found silenced. Governments on both sides used the attacks for propaganda. Each state condemned the enemy's brutality while presenting its own retaliation as necessary justice. Newspapers published photographs of destruction inflicted by the other side. Speeches promised resilience and eventual victory. Martyrs were honored. Blame was never in short supply, but civilians in both capitals understood a harsher truth. Missile did not ask whom someone supported. It did not care who backed the war or opposed it. It did not distinguish between loyalist and dissident, soldier's child and shopkeeper's child, believer and skeptic. On se lunch reduced politics to survival. Still the cycle continued. An Iraqi strike on Iranian neighborhoods would be followed by Iranian retaliation. Iranian attacks on Baghdad would be answered again. Every new crater became justification for the next launch. Every funeral nourished anger. Every destroyed apartment block became evidence that compromise was impossible. This is how wars become self-sustaining. They feed on grief and transform grief into policy. Outside observers watched with growing alarm. The broader war already threatened oil shipping in the Persian Gulf and drew international concern. Now the deliberate targeting of urban centers made clear that the conflict was expanding morally as well as militarily. If capitals could be treated as battlefields, then the distinction between front and rear had nearly vanished. Yet, even in this darkness, ordinary humanity endured. Neighbors dug strangers from roofs. Taxi drivers transported the wounded without charge. Teachers gathered children in shelters and turned fear into lessons or songs. Bakers reopened after blasts so others could eat. Families with intact homes took in relatives whose homes were gone. Across political systems and national boundaries, civilians behaved in ways far nobler than the war around them. That resilience should never be mistaken for immunity. People can endure terrible things and still be scarred by them. The child who sleeps through sirens may be adapting or surrendering part of childhood itself by the late years of the conflict. Both Tehran and Baghdad had become symbols of endurance under fire. But symbols are built from real streets, real homes, and real names listed among the dead. The war of the cities had become more than strategy. It was now habit, a ritual of revenge repeated across the night sky, and habits of war are the hardest to break. By 1988, after nearly 8 years of war, exhaustion had become a force as powerful as any army. The conflict between Iran and Iraq had consumed hundreds of thousands of lives, devastated border regions, drained national economies, and reshaped an entire generation through loss. At the front, trenches still scarred the landscape. Patrols still crossed marshes and minefields. Artillery still opened the day and closed the night. Yet beneath the continuing violence, something fundamental had changed. Neither side was fighting with the confidence of early ambitions. They were fighting because they had not yet stopped end in that final phase. The cities would once again bear the burden. Iraq had improved its missile capability during the war, including the use of extended-range variants, such as the Al-Hussein missile. These weapons could travel farther than earlier systems, placing deeper Iranian targets within reach. Most importantly, they could strike the heart of Iran, its capital, Tehran. When the new wave of attacks began, the effect was immediate. Missiles arced toward the city in repeated barrages. Some struck residential districts, others landed near roads, industrial sites, or public spaces. Each launch created not only casualties and destruction, but anticipation of the next strike. Tehran had already endured years of wartime hardship, but this concentrated campaign brought a new intensity of fear. Families who had previously stayed now reconsidered. Roads leading out of the capital filled again with traffic. Cars carried mattresses tied to roofs, children asleep in back seats, elderly parents wrapped in blankets, and whatever possessions could be loaded in haste. Bus stations overflowed. Train tickets vanished. Those with relatives in smaller towns fled to them. Those without such options often remained and hoped. Entire neighborhoods seemed empty. Shops opened irregularly or not at all. Schools were disrupted. Offices worked with reduced staff. Streets once crowded with ordinary movement became quieter, interrupted by sirens, emergency vehicles, and columns of smoke in the distance. The capital of a nation at war was beginning to feel hollowed out. From within. For those who stayed, life narrowed to essentials. Where is the nearest shelter? Is there enough water? Who has been reached by phonos? That explosion close? Will there be another? Tonight such questions replaced normal plans for the future. War compresses time. People stop thinking in years and begin thinking in hours. Hospitals in Tehran faced another surge of wounded civilians. Rescue crews dug through damaged buildings, while families gathered outside searching faces, calling names, refusing to accept silence as an answer. Funeral processions returned to the streets. Public grief had become familiar. But familiarity did not lessen. Pan-Iranian leaders faced realities beyond the missile campaign alone. The wider war had shifted against them in several sectors. Iraqi forces had regained important territory. Iraq also continued to employ chemical weapons on the battlefield, adding another layer of dread to an already brutal conflict. International diplomacy, long frustrated, gained new urgency. The cost of continuing the war was no longer measured only in military setbacks. It was measured in cities under fire, civilians in flight, and a society nearing the limits of endurance. For years, official rhetoric had emphasized perseverance and sacrifice. Many Iranians had accepted extraordinary hardship in the belief that endurance would secure justice and safety. But by 1988, endurance itself had become uncertain currency. How much more could be asked of civilians already shaped by funerals, displacement, and fear? The answer arrived in diplomacy. United Nations Resolution 598, Fies Passed 1987, called for a ceasefire, prisoner exchanges, and negotiations. For months, it had remained unrealized. Now, the political atmosphere changed under mounting military and civilian pressure. Iran agreed to accept the resolution. A decision was historic and painful for a nation that had endured invasion and years of sacrifice. Accepting a ceasefire without clear victory was emotionally difficult. Iranian leader Ruhollah Khomeini famously compared the decision to drinking from a poisoned chalice, an image that captured the bitterness of ending a war without the triumph many had hoped for. Yet for millions of civilians, the meaning was simpler. It meant the sirens might stop. It meant children might sleep without listening for engines or impacts. It meant roads out of Tehran might one day become roads home. In August 1988, the ceasefire took effect. The guns did not fall silent in a single magical moment, nor did all wounds close when diplomats signed papers. Prisoners still waited to return. Border disputes remained unresolved. Families still searched for the missing. Cemeteries still expanded. With the dead of 8 terrible years, and there was no true victory. Iraq had not conquered Iran. Iran had not overthrown Iraq's regime. The border largely returned to its pre-war lines. After vast sacrifice, the map looked hauntingly familiar, but maps cannot show trauma. They do not mark the apartment buildings destroyed in Tehran or the neighborhoods shattered in Baghdad. They do not record the child who still fears thunder because it sounds like artillery. They do not measure the years family spent waiting for relatives who never return. That is the legacy of the War of the Cities. It demonstrated that modern war can erase the boundary between soldier and civilian with terrifying ease. It showed how technology allows leaders to project violence deep into ordinary life. It revealed how retaliation can become routine, and routine can become tragedy yet. It also revealed something else. Under missiles, people continued to help one another. They shared shelter, carried strangers from Rubel, reopened shops, treated the wounded, comforted children, and rebuilt after every blast. Governments chose escalation. Civilians chose survival today. The names Tehran and Baghdad still evoke capitals of history, culture, and resilience. But for those who lived through those years, they will always also be cities that once waited through the night for the sound of incoming war, and that memory outlasts every ceasefire. The War of the Cities ended with a ceasefire, but not with victory. The borders remained nearly the same. The leaders stayed in power, yet thousands of homes were destroyed. Countless civilians were scarred, and two capitals carried memories no treaty could erase. Tehran and Baghdad. The greatest survivors were not armies, but ordinary people who endured fear, loss, and uncertainty, and still rebuilt. Their lives' history often remembers wars through generals and maps, but sometimes the real story lives in the families who waited through the night for the next explosion never to come. If you enjoyed this documentary, subscribe for more true stories from history, where the forgotten voices still speak.